The day I lost my son, the world didn't just collapse, it turned to ash in my hands. In the middle of that inferno, my wife, Chloe, didn't hand me water. She ran off with her new lover and emptied the bank accounts I thought were building our future. Her parents, the ever-powerful Prescotts, cornered me at my own son's funeral. Her father, Arthur, looked right through me and said I was nothing more than a tragedy of circumstance, a failure who couldn't even provide enough to save his own child. They all thought I was just a broke, pathetic, blue-collar nobody they could discard like trash. They had no idea that the quiet IT guy they mocked for years had been building a silent empire in the digital shadows, an empire with enough power to turn their perfect, manicured world into a pile of rubble. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will hear the sound of that empire falling. My name is Leo Sullivan, and for the last 10 years, I've been the Invisible Man. To anyone in the upscale Seattle suburbs where we lived a house owned by my father-in-law, of course, I was Chloe Prescott's quiet, unassuming husband, the guy in the faded jeans and 10-year-old Subaru who worked some boring tech job downtown while she managed a high-end art gallery. I was a ghost at their lavish parties, a polite nod in the corner while my father-in-law, Arthur Prescott, held court, boasting about his latest real estate conquest. Arthur was a titan carved from granite and greed. To him, success was a skyscraper, a stock portfolio, a headline in the business journal. I, with my modest salary and calloused hands from my woodworking hobby, was a daily disappointment, a living symbol of the life his daughter could have had if she'd married into one of Seattle's other dynasties. His wife, my mother-in-law Eleanor, was even worse, in a way. Her disapproval wasn't loud and booming like Arthur's. It was a quiet, constant poison. It was in the way she'd look at my car when I pulled up to their waterfront mansion, a flicker of disgust in her eyes. It was in her backhanded compliments at Sunday dinners. "Oh, Leo, it's so quaint that you still enjoy working with your hands," she'd say, gesturing toward my oil-stained fingers as if I'd brought a dead animal to the table. Most men of ambition have outgrown such things. Every Sunday was the same ordeal. We'd sit at a polished mahogany table that was longer than my first apartment, and I'd feel their judgment pressing down on me like the damp Seattle air. Arthur would grill me about my career, his questions dripping with condescension. "Still happy in that little cubicle, Leo? Not aiming for a C-suite, are we? Takes a certain killer instinct, I suppose." Chloe would just sit there, swirling her wine, a tight, forced smile on her face. She never defended me. She'd just give me a look later, a look that said, "Why do you have to make it so hard? Why can't you just be more?" I endured it all for one reason: my son Sam. Sam was 8 years old, and he was my entire world. He had my messy brown hair, but Chloe's bright, curious eyes. He wasn't like the other kids in our neighborhood who were already being groomed for Ivy League schools. Sam was a builder, an architect of imaginary worlds. Our garage was our sanctuary, while the Prescott saw it as a grimy workshop filled with sawdust and scrap wood. For Sam and me, it was our fortress of solitude. It was where I taught him how to measure twice and cut once, and where he would sit for hours, meticulously assembling the most intricate Lego sets you've ever seen. His current project was his masterpiece, a massive 4-foot-tall replica of the Seattle Space Needle. It was our thing. Every night after I got home from work, we'd spend an hour on it, piece by piece, dreaming of the day we'd put the final antenna on top. "When it's done, Dad," he'd say, his face lit with concentration, "it'll be so tall it can touch the stars." In those moments, the Prescott's world of judgment and ambition just melted away. There was only the quiet click of Lego bricks and the sound of my son's happy chatter. I looked at him, so full of life and unfiltered joy, and I knew I could endure anything. I could be the Invisible Man. I could swallow Arthur's insults and Eleanor's disdain. I could watch my own wife slowly drift away from me, pulled into the orbit of her parents' wealth. I could do it all, as long as I had my son. As long as Sam was there, I had a reason to keep our fragile world from shattering. I just never imagined he'd be the one to go first. The change was so subtle at first, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It started on a crisp Saturday morning in October. I was in the garage, sanding down a piece of reclaimed maple for a coffee table, and the air was filled with that sweet, woody scent I loved. Sam was at his workstation, the skeleton of the Lego Space Needle towering over him. Usually, our Saturday mornings were a symphony of noise, my sander humming, the rattle of him digging through a bin of Legos, his constant stream of questions and stories. But that morning, there was just silence. I shut off the sander and looked over. He was just sitting there, a single gray Lego brick in his hand, staring at the half-finished tower with a glazed-over look in his eyes. "Everything okay, buddy?" I asked, wiping sawdust from my hands. He looked up at me, and his usual bright spark was missing. "My head hurts, Dad. Like, a lot." My heart did a little tripwire stumble, that instant, irrational panic every parent knows. But I pushed it down. "Kids get headaches. It's normal. Probably just need some water," I said, forcing a calm smile. "Let's take a break. We can work on the observation deck later." He just nodded, not even arguing. And that was the first real alarm bell. Sam never wanted to stop building. I mentioned it to Chloe when she came downstairs, dressed for a brunch with some artists from the gallery. She was a vision in a cream-colored cashmere sweater, scrolling through her phone, already a world away. "Sam's got a pretty bad headache," I said, keeping my voice casual. "He seems really off." She didn't look up. "He's probably just trying to get out of cleaning his room, Leo. You know how he is. Give him some Tylenol and make sure he drinks some juice." She kissed the air near my cheek and was out the door, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering like a ghost. I stood there in the kitchen, feeling a familiar sense of dismissal. To her, it was an inconvenience, a tiny blip on her perfectly curated radar. To me, that quiet boy in the garage felt like the beginning of a storm. The Tylenol didn't work. By the afternoon, Sam was lying on the couch, a damp cloth over his eyes, refusing to even look at the TV. He'd lost all interest in our project, in his toys, in everything. The vibrant color of his world was draining away, leaving only a dull, painful gray. My anxiety grew from a small knot into a thick, choking rope in my chest. That night, I insisted on calling her parents to cancel our Sunday dinner. Chloe fought me on it. "They're expecting us, Leo." "It's rude, he's just got a bug." "Something's wrong, Chloe," I insisted, my voice firmer than I usually allowed it to be with her. "I want to take him to a specialist." That's when she did what she always did when she felt I was challenging her perfect world. She called her father. A few minutes later, I was on speakerphone with Arthur and Eleanor Prescott, their voices crackling with authority and condescension. "Eleanor tells me you're in a panic over a headache, Leo." Arthur's voice boomed from the phone. "It's more than that, Arthur. He's lethargic. He's not eating." "For heaven's sake, Leo," Eleanor cut in, her voice sharp and brittle. "Children get sick. It's probably just too much screen time. You do let him use one of those tablets, don't you? It rots their little minds." I closed my eyes, my hand tightening on the phone. "He hasn't been on a tablet all day." "Listen, son," Arthur said, his tone shifting to one of a king dispensing wisdom to a court jester. "Don't overreact. You take him to some emergency room. They'll run 1,000 useless, expensive tests that'll just scare the boy. It's what people in your situation tend to do. Panic. If it's still an issue in a week, I'll make a call. My guy at the university hospital can squeeze him in. No need to act like you can't afford a common cold." And there it was. The insult wrapped in a favor, the reminder of my place. He wasn't worried about his grandson. He was worried I would embarrass him by acting poor and desperate. Chloe was looking at me, her arms crossed, nodding along with her father. In that moment, I had never felt more alone. I was the only one in the room who saw the shadow falling over our son. They were all just annoyed that it might cast a darkness on them. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. They wanted me to wait a week. A week. I looked over at my son, so small and pale on the couch, and I felt a surge of protective rage that was so fierce it almost buckled my knees. They didn't see him. They saw an inconvenience, a disruption, a line item on a future budget. I saw my reason for breathing. That night, as I sat by his bed, he woke up whimpering. "Dad," he whispered, his voice weak. "The room is wobbly, and the lights are too bright." He squeezed his eyes shut. That was it. That was the moment I decided I was done listening to anyone else. To hell with Arthur's connections. To hell with Chloe's brunch. I didn't care about being polite or knowing my place anymore. I scooped Sam's small, feverish body into my arms, his head resting against my shoulder. His little frame felt terrifyingly light. I carried him out of the room, past Chloe, who was sleeping soundly in our bed, and walked out into the cold, dark night. The old Subaru started with a familiar rumble. As I pulled out of the driveway, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was driving away from more than just our house. I was driving into a nightmare, and I was doing it all alone. The emergency room was a special kind of hell, a sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory filled with the quiet desperation of beeping machines and the clipped, professional tones of people who had seen it all before. I held Sam's small hand, his fingers limp in mine, as they wheeled him into a curtained-off bay. They asked me questions I could barely answer, my mind a fog of panic. When did the headaches start? Any history of seizures? Has he had a fever? Every question felt like an accusation, as if I had missed something, as if I should have known. Sam was too weak to even cry, his eyes squeezed shut against the harsh overhead lights. I was his father, his protector, and in that moment I had never felt so utterly powerless. Hours blurred together under the relentless hum of the hospital. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my jacket still smelling of sawdust from the garage, a scent from a world that no longer existed. Nurses and doctors moved around us with efficient, detached grace, their faces a mask of calm professionalism that felt almost cruel. Finally, a neurologist with tired, kind eyes pulled me into a small, windowless consultation room. The air was thick with the unspoken gravity of bad news. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "we've looked at the MRI scans. Your son has a tumor. It's called a diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, a DIPG. The acronyms were meaningless, a jumble of clinical sounds that my brain refused to process. "A tumor?" I repeated, the words feeling foreign and heavy in my mouth. "But how?" He was fine. He was building his Lego tower just this morning. The doctor's eyes held a deep, profound sadness, the look of a man who had delivered this same speech too many times. "It's a highly aggressive and rare form of brain cancer, Leo," he said, switching to my first name. "It grows in the brainstem, intertwined with the nerves that control essential bodily functions. It's inoperable." Inoperable. The word didn't just hang in the air. It crashed down on me, shattering everything. It was a final, brutal judgment. It was the sound of a door slamming shut and locking from the other side. My breath caught in my chest, a ragged, painful gasp. I thought of Sam, of his laughter, of his bright, curious eyes, and I felt the floor give way beneath me. I was falling, tumbling into a cold, dark abyss, and there was nothing to hold on to. The doctor kept talking, mentioning radiation, clinical trials, palliative care words that were meant to sound like hope, but felt like echoes in a tomb. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Sam was moved to the pediatric oncology ward, a place of devastating quiet and forced cheerfulness, with cartoon animals painted on the walls that seemed to mock the suffering within them. I never left. I slept, or tried to, in a lumpy recliner next to his bed that smelled faintly of antiseptic. I watched the IV drip, a steady, metronomic count of the time we had left. I held his hand, whispering stories about the forests and coastlines of the Puget Sound, trying to fill the sterile room with memories of a life that felt a million miles away. Chloe's visits were brief, fleeting interruptions in my vigil. She'd arrive after a long day at the gallery, her high heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. She'd stand at the foot of the bed, looking at our son as if he were a piece of abstract art she couldn't quite comprehend. She'd ask the nurses clinical questions about his medication, check the messages on her phone, and then touch Sam's arm with the tips of her fingers. "I have a major donor event to prepare for, Leo," she'd say, her voice a strained whisper. "It's for the children's wing, you know. I have to be there." She was a ghost in our tragedy, present in body but absent in soul. She couldn't handle the raw, ugly reality of it. It didn't fit into her perfectly curated world. Each time she left, the silence she left behind was louder and more profound than the beeping of the machines. The Prescotts visited exactly once. They swept into the room like royalty, making a reluctant visit to the peasant quarters, Arthur in a tailored suit, and Eleanor clutching a designer handbag like a shield. They didn't look at Sam, who was sleeping fitfully, his small face pale against the white pillow. They looked at me. "We spoke with Dr. Matthews," Arthur began, his voice low and accusatory. He explained the situation. Eleanor surveyed the small room, her nose wrinkled in distaste. "This is all just so dreadful," she sighed, as if Sam's cancer were a social inconvenience. I always felt the stress of this mediocre household was unhealthy. Children are so sensitive to their environment, you know. They absorb the tension. I stared at her, my mind reeling. The stress of my household? The tension I created? My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my knuckles white. Arthur stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial growl. Look, Leo, what's done is done. We'll handle it. We've set up a fund, a charitable donation in Sam's name to the hospital. It will be very good for the Prescott family's public image. A tragedy, yes, but we can turn it into a positive statement about our commitment to the community. I felt the rage then, a white-hot, blinding inferno. It burned away the grief, the fear, the desperation, leaving only a core of pure, undiluted fury. They were talking about branding. They were talking about public relations. My son was dying in the bed next to them, and they were workshopping a press release. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, walked to the door, and held it open. My gaze was cold, empty, and absolute. They saw something in my eyes they had never seen before, not the quiet, accommodating man they despised, but something harder, something broken and dangerous. They left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it, my body trembling. The room was quiet again, save for the soft sigh of the respirator. I walked back to the bed and took Sam's hand. In that moment, the world shrank to the four walls of that room. There was no Chloe. There were no Prescotts. There was no one else. It was just me and my boy. I was his father. And I was completely, utterly, and terrifyingly alone. There was no dramatic, movie-like final speech. There was no miraculous recovery. There was only a slow, quiet fading. For 3 weeks I sat in that sterile room and watched the light in my son's eyes dim until there was nothing left. In his last moments he wasn't conscious. It was just me, holding his small, frail hand, my thumb stroking his knuckles. I whispered to him about the Lego Space Needle, promising him that I would finish it, that I would put the final piece on top for him. I told him it was okay to rest. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed, became erratic, and then flatlined into a single, piercing, continuous tone that cut through the silence of the room and severed the last thread of hope I didn't even know I was still clinging to. The nurses came in and turned off the machines, and in the sudden, deafening quiet, the world went gray. It was like a switch had been flipped inside my head, draining all the color, all the sound, all the feeling from everything. I remember kissing his forehead. It was already cool. I remember a social worker talking to me in a soft, gentle voice, her words buzzing around my head like meaningless static. I walked out of that hospital and into a Seattle morning shrouded in a thick, drizzling mist. The city was gray, the sky was gray, and the hole that had been ripped open inside of me was a vast, bottomless gray void. My son was gone. The funeral was an exercise in surreal, quiet torture. The Prescotts arranged everything, of course. It was held at a prestigious old stone church downtown that they had endowed a wing for. It wasn't a place for mourning. It was a stage for their performance of grief. I stood near the small, polished casket, a ghost in a suit that felt 2 sizes too big. People I barely knew came up to me, murmuring condolences, their faces a blur of polite sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Leo. He's in a better place now." The words were meaningless pebbles dropped into the vast emptiness inside me. Chloe stood beside me, but she might as well have been on another continent. She was dressed in an elegant, simple black dress, playing the part of the grieving mother flawlessly. She accepted hugs, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, and spoke in hushed, somber tones. But she never once reached for my hand. She never once met my eyes. Her grief was a public performance. Mine was a private, suffocating ocean, and we were drowning in it separately. Her parents worked the room like it was one of their charity galas. Arthur shook hands with business associates, his face a mask of solemn dignity. Eleanor accepted condolences from her socialite friends, a tragic but composed matriarch. They were networking at their own grandson's funeral. The sheer, monstrous audacity of it barely registered through my fog of numbness. I stepped away for a moment, needing to breathe air that wasn't thick with the scent of lilies and hypocrisy. I stood in a small alcove near the back of the church, looking out the stained glass window at the relentless rain. That's when I heard Arthur's voice, low and conspiratorial, just a few feet away. He was talking to another man in an expensive suit, one of his real estate rivals. It's a terrible business, Marcus. Just terrible, Arthur said, his voice laced with a tone of profound philosophical sadness. A real tragedy, Arthur. My heart goes out to you and Chloe, the other man replied. And then Arthur delivered the line that would echo in my mind forever, the line that became the foundation of everything that came after. It is, he sighed, shaking his head. But you know, you can't help but wonder. If he had been a real provider, the boy might have had access to experimental treatments down in California. A tragedy of circumstance, really. The words didn't hit me like a punch. They slid into me like a shard of ice, piercing through the numb gray fog and striking something raw and vital. A tragedy of circumstance. My circumstance. My failure. He wasn't just mourning his grandson. He was closing a deal, cementing his own narrative of superiority, even in the face of our shared loss. He was using my son's death as a way to underscore my worthlessness. I turned my head slowly. Chloe was standing nearby. She had heard it too. I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the briefest moment of conflict. She looked from her father to me, standing alone in the shadows, my face ashen, and in that moment she made her choice. She walked over to her father, placed a gentle hand on his arm, and guided him away, as if to protect him from any unpleasantness. She left me standing there, utterly alone, with her father's cruel words twisting in my gut. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, acrid wave that burned through the cold grief. They were blaming me for my own son's death. In their world, love wasn't enough. Devotion wasn't enough. Only money and power had value, and I had neither. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers closed around a small plastic brick, the red 2x4 block that was meant to be the flashing light atop the Lego Space Needle. I squeezed it until the sharp corners dug into my palm. The pain was real. It was a focal point in the gray, colorless world. And in that alcove, as the organ began to play a mournful hymn, the grief inside me didn't disappear, but something new and hard began to crystallize around it. It was cold, it was sharp, and it was waiting. The days after the funeral passed in a hazy, silent film. I wasn't living, I was existing. I moved through our house, the Prescott's house, like a ghost, an automaton performing meaningless routines. I'd make coffee I didn't drink. I'd open my laptop and stare at a blank screen. Every room echoed with a terrible quiet, a silence where Sam's laughter used to be. The house was no longer a home. It had become a mausoleum of memories. I'd find myself standing for hours outside my son's doorway, looking in at the room that was still, painfully, just as he'd left it. The half-finished Lego Space Needle stood on his desk, a monument to a future that had been stolen. On the third day, a different kind of emptiness pierced through my numb haze. It was the absence of Chloe. At first, I assumed she was with her parents, seeking a comfort I couldn't provide. But then I noticed the gaps. Her side of the closet was half empty. The jewelry box on her dresser was gone. Her favorite expensive heels were no longer lined up on the rack. She hadn't just left. She had methodically erased herself from my life. And then I saw it. Lying on the cold marble kitchen island where we once shared breakfast was a crisp manila envelope. My hands trembled as I picked it up. They were divorce papers. On top, a short handwritten note in Chloe's elegant detached script. Leo, I'm sorry. This is better for both of us. Better? I stood there, stunned, the papers slipping from my numb fingers and scattering on the floor. My world had just been reduced to ash, our son had just been buried, and her solution was a clean legal proceeding? No conversation, no goodbye. Just silence, empty spaces, and now this formalized, notarized betrayal. I felt like I was sinking in an icy ocean, the shock of it stealing the air from my lungs. A cold, sickening premonition snaked its way up my spine. This wasn't just about her leaving, it was something more. Driven by a gut instinct I couldn't explain, I stumbled to my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into our bank. It was a joint savings account, but the money in it was mine. It was the quiet, hidden result of my years of work. The money from S Ventures that I had funneled there to build a secure future for my family, for Sam. I had pictured using it for his college education, for buying a real home of our own, away from the Prescott's control. The page loaded, and I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. Balance, $0. A single, brutal, perfect zero. It was all gone. Every last cent. She hadn't just left me, she had gutted me. She had taken everything I had secretly built for us, for our son, and left nothing but a void. The numbness was absolute now, a layer of ice so thick I felt nothing at all. Just then, my phone buzzed with a social media notification. A mutual friend had tagged Chloe in a post. My heart seized. Almost against my will, I tapped the screen, and the image that appeared shattered the last of the ice, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow emptiness. It was Chloe. But not the grieving Chloe I knew. She was in Aspen. She was wearing a brilliant white ski jacket, her cheeks rosy from the cold, and she was laughing. A radiant, carefree smile, the kind I hadn't seen in years. Standing next to her was Julian Vance, the charismatic artist from her gallery, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. Snowflakes dusted the air around them, and they looked like a couple from a luxury winter catalog. The post's caption was just 4 words: "Finding the sunshine again." There was no mention of Sam, no sign of loss. It was as if the last few weeks, the hospital, the funeral, had never happened, as if our son was just a sad chapter she had closed and walked away from. I sat there in the dark, empty house, the phone's screen lighting up my face. I had lost my son. I had lost my wife. And now I had lost the future I had silently built. They had taken everything. They had called me a failure. But they didn't realize they had left one thing behind. They had left a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. And a man like that is the most dangerous man of all. I don't remember the drive. It was like the world outside the windshield of my Subaru ceased to exist. The familiar Seattle streets, the gray sky, the drizzle, it was all just a blur. The only thing in focus was a single, burning point of clarity in my mind. The numbness was gone, the shock had passed, and the vast, hollow emptiness had been filled with something new. It was a cold, clean rage, as pure and hard as a diamond. It didn't make me want to scream or smash things. It focused me. For the first time in days, I had a purpose. I was driving to the gates of their waterfront palace, the place where all my pain had been manufactured, and I was going to look my makers in the eye. The Prescott Mansion was even more obscene than I remembered. It sat on the edge of Lake Washington, a monument of glass and steel and cold, hard stone, surrounded by gardens so perfectly manicured they looked artificial. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress built to keep the messiness of the real world out. I parked my old mud-splattered car behind a gleaming black Mercedes and walked up the slate pathway, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet, wealthy air. A housekeeper opened the door, her eyes widening slightly in surprise at seeing me. I walked past her without a word. I found them in the grand living room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark, churning water of the lake. Arthur was pouring 2 glasses of what looked like an expensive whiskey, and Eleanor was arranging a bouquet of white orchids with surgical precision. They were framed by the window like a portrait of untouchable elegance, the picture of a couple completely insulated from the tragedy that had just consumed their family. They turned as I entered. Arthur's face tightened with annoyance. "Leo," he said, his voice flat, "this isn't a good time." "She took the money, Arthur," I said. My own voice sounded strange to me, devoid of the grief and desperation that had choked it for weeks. It was level and cold, all of it. The money I had saved for Sam's future. Arthur actually laughed. It wasn't a loud, booming laugh, but a short, sharp bark of amusement, as if I'd just told a particularly pathetic joke. He swirled the whiskey in his glass and took a slow sip before looking at me, his eyes glittering with contempt. "That money?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Consider it a long overdue severance package. Payment for the 10 years Chloe wasted trying to make something out of you. You were a project, Leo. A charity case. And you failed. You're worthless dead weight, and frankly, this family is better off for cutting you loose." Every word was designed to be a killing blow, to shatter what little was left of me. But something inside me had changed. The words didn't break me. They bounced off something that had become as hard as steel. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, truly seeing the reptilian coldness behind his mask of civility. Eleanor set down her flower shears and drifted closer, her face a mask of bored pity. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my simple clothes, as if they were a personal offense to her. You really don't get it, do you? She said, her voice a soft, silken whisper that was more venomous than her husband's shouting. This isn't a tragedy for Chloe. It's a liberation. Chloe has finally found her equal in Julian, a man of substance, of culture, of means, someone who belongs in her world. You should be grateful for the years you had with her. No one ever thought it would last this long. That was it, the final, perfect piece of their cruelty. They hadn't just endorsed their daughter's betrayal, they had orchestrated it, celebrated it. In their eyes, my entire marriage, my love for their daughter, my role as a father, it was all a sham, a temporary arrangement, until something better came along. My son's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a convenient end to an inconvenient chapter. I looked from her face to his, and the rage inside me didn't burn hotter. It cooled, condensing into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. The grief for my son was still there, a permanent fixture in my soul, but it was now encased in this new, indestructible certainty. The invisible man they had mocked and belittled for a decade died in that room. The man who walked out was someone else entirely. I didn't say another word. I just turned my back on them and walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of their lives. I could feel their amused, dismissive stares on my back. They thought they had won. They thought they had crushed me, that I was scurrying back to whatever hole I had crawled out of. As I got into my old Subaru and started the engine, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes staring back weren't filled with tears or pain. They were clear, focused, and utterly cold. The Prescotts thought they knew who I was. They had no idea. They had just closed the gates of their world on me. They would soon find out that they hadn't locked me out. They had locked themselves in with me. I didn't go back to the house. It wasn't my house anyway. It was just another gilded cage owned by the Prescotts. I left the Subaru in a long-term parking garage, a relic of a life that was no longer mine, and took a cab to a place I had prepared for a contingency I never truly wanted to face. It was a small, furnished apartment in an anonymous glass tower in Belltown, overlooking the sprawling industrial guts of the Port of Seattle. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and waterfront views of the Prescott's neighborhood. This was a place of work, of grit, of reality. The apartment was sparse, with little more than a bed, a table, and a chair, but I hadn't rented it for the furniture. I opened a large, heavy-duty Pelican case I had stored in the closet, and began to set up my real office. Within an hour, the simple table was transformed into a command center, dominated by a sleek, custom-built laptop and 2 encrypted hard drives. This was my real workshop. The sawdust and wood shavings of my garage were gone, replaced by the cool, silent hum of immense processing power. As I connected the final cable, I looked out the window. Below, the cranes of the port moved with a slow, steady rhythm, loading and unloading cargo under the gray Seattle sky. It reminded me of home. Not the sterile mansion I had just left, but my real home. I was born and raised in a small logging town in rural Oregon, a place where the air smelled of pine and diesel, and a man's worth was measured by the strength of his back and the honesty of his word. My father was a mechanic, a wizard who could bring any engine back from the dead with nothing but grease-stained hands and an unshakable patience. He worked 16-hour days to keep our family afloat and never once complained. Money's a tool, Leo, he used to tell me, his eyes kind but firm. It's not a trophy. Never let it own you. My mother was a librarian who filled our small, cluttered house with books and taught me that the quietest people often have the most to say. They were good, honest people who despised pretension. They were everything the Prescotts were not. I was a quiet kid, but my mind moved at a different speed. While other boys were learning to hunt or fish, I was taking apart old radios and teaching myself to code on a discarded computer from the library. I wasn't a killer like Arthur Prescott, driven by ego and conquest. I was a builder, fascinated by the silent, logical elegance of the digital world. It was a world where your pedigree didn't matter, only your skill. I got a scholarship to study computer science and moved to the city, full of quiet ambition. My boring tech job as an IT architect was real, but it was only a fraction of the story. It was my cover. My real work began after hours. In my early 20s, while working at a small startup, I developed a revolutionary data encryption algorithm. The company wanted to buy the patent for a decent but finite sum. My dad's words echoed in my head. Money's a tool. I saw a bigger picture. I found a mentor, a retired tech executive named Ben, who saw the spark in me. Together, we founded a holding company. We sold a small part of the patent for seed money, and on a calculated hunch during the early crypto boom, we invested it all. The return was astronomical. It was the kind of life-changing money that destroys most people. But I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. I remembered my father's warning. Instead, we created S Ventures. The S was for Sullivan, a silent tribute to the family name I felt I had to hide. S Ventures was a ghost. It had no office, no public face. It was a digital entity, a silent force in the world of cybersecurity and AI, acquiring promising startups and investing in groundbreaking tech. To the world, S Ventures was an enigma, a new player with impossibly deep pockets. No one knew it was run by a quiet IT guy who found peace in woodworking and drove a 10-year-old car. When I met Chloe, I fell for the woman I thought she could be, not the Prescott she was. I kept my world a secret because I wanted to be loved for Leo Sullivan, the quiet guy who made her laugh, not for the anonymous wealth of S Ventures. I saw how her parents worshipped money, how it was a weapon and a status symbol, and I wanted to build a life with her that was real, grounded in something more than a bank statement. For a while, I thought it was working, but I wasn't naive. I saw the pull her family's world had on her, so I played the long game. The money Chloe just stole? It was a lot, enough to fund a life of luxury. But it was a calculated loss. It was from a joint account I had set up as a firewall, a family fund for the future I had hoped we'd have. It was the only part of my fortune she could ever touch. My real assets, the vast, silent empire of S Ventures, were locked away behind layers of trusts and corporate firewalls she couldn't even imagine. She thought she had taken my life savings. In reality, she had stolen the petty cash. I finished my setup and logged into the S Ventures mainframe. The screen flickered to life, displaying dashboards of real-time market data, investment portfolios, and encrypted communications. And in the top corner, my personal portfolio balance. It was a number so large it looked like a line of code, an 11-digit number. I stared at it, but I felt no pride, no thrill of power. All I felt was the cold, heavy weight of purpose. For years I had been a ghost in the machine, moving silently, building a world they couldn't see. I did it to protect my family from the very poison that had just destroyed it. Now, that ghost was finally awake. And it was time to show the Prescotts what happens when you anger the man who built the machine from the inside out. The next morning I made a call. An hour later, I was in a secure, soundproofed meeting room in a downtown skyscraper, a confidential space S Ventures maintained for operations that required a physical presence. It was a place of quiet, immense power, with a single mahogany table and a wall that was a high-resolution screen. The first person to arrive was Ben Carter, my mentor and the only other partner in S Ventures. Ben was in his late 60s, with a sharp mind and kinder eyes than any other executive I had ever met. He was the one who had seen the potential in a quiet kid with a revolutionary algorithm all those years ago. He was more than a partner. He was the closest thing I had to a father figure. He didn't greet me with a handshake. He walked straight over and wrapped his arms around me in a firm, grounding hug. "I was so sorry to hear about your boy, Leo," he said, his voice rough with genuine emotion. There are no words. For a moment, I let the cold facade crack, leaning into his support. He was the only person in this world who knew both sides of me, the grieving father and the silent architect of an empire. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Ben." He pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "What is this?" The summons was urgent. "It's time," I said, my voice hardening, the crack sealing over with ice. "It's time for the ghost to come out of the machine." Just then, the rest of the team filed in. Our lead counsel, a shark of a woman named Anya Sharma, and our chief financial strategist, a quiet numbers genius named Marcus Thorne. They were the best in their fields, and they had made a fortune working for the anonymous head of S Ventures, but neither of them had ever met me in person. I saw the flicker of surprise in their eyes as they saw me. Not some ruthless titan in a power suit, but a quiet, tired-looking man in a simple gray sweater. I didn't waste time on introductions. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," I began, my voice calm and even. I tapped a command on the tablet embedded in the table. and the wall screen lit up, displaying the corporate logo of Prescott Holdings. Anya raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Prescott Holdings? The real estate developer? They're dinosaurs, Leo. Not our usual target. What's the play? A short? No, I said, my gaze fixed on the screen. Not a short. A decapitation. I brought up a complex flowchart of shell corporations and holding companies, a web so intricate it looked like a schematic for a circuit board. For the past 5 years, we have been quietly acquiring non-voting shares in this company. It was a stable, low-risk diversification for the portfolio. As of this morning, through these 37 different entities, S Ventures controls 42% of the company's stock. Marcus Thorne, who rarely spoke, let out a low whistle. 42%, he murmured, his eyes racing across the data. They'll never see that coming. Their public filings wouldn't show a single hostile entity. That's the point, I said. Now, I want you to start consolidating. Trigger the buyout clauses in 3 of our holding companies. Convert all non-voting shares to voting stock. I want a controlling interest. 51%. I don't care what it costs. I want it done by the end of the month, just before their annual board meeting. The room was silent for a moment. Anya leaned forward, her expression shifting from surprise to sharp-edged concern. Leo, that's a hostile takeover. It's loud, it's public, it's bloody. It goes against everything we've ever done. Our entire strategy is built on anonymity, on surgical precision. This is a sledgehammer. She's right, Marcus added. The market will panic. The Prescotts will fight back with everything they have. It's messy. I looked at them, my expression unyielding. They saw the financial risk, the breach of strategy. They couldn't see the raw, burning wound that was driving this. Your concerns are noted, I said, my voice dropping to a level that left no room for argument. This isn't a financial decision. It's a strategic one. Arthur Prescott has a debt to pay, and I am here to collect. I turned to the screen and brought up a satellite image of the Prescott mansion, the fortress I had walked out of the day before. This man believes the world can be bought and sold. He believes people are assets to be leveraged or discarded. I'm going to take his world apart, piece by piece, starting with the company that is the source of all his power. I want him left with nothing but his name, and by the time I'm done, that name will be worthless. Anya and Marcus exchanged a look. The surprise was gone, replaced by a dawning, steely understanding. They were looking at their mysterious, faceless boss for the first time, and seeing a man on a mission of absolute single-minded vengeance. They didn't need to know the why. They just needed the what. Execute the plan, I said, and get me a seat at that board meeting. The 3 weeks leading up to the Prescott Holdings annual board meeting were the quietest of my life. From my command center overlooking the port, I watched a silent digital war unfold. Billions of dollars moved through cyberspace like ghosts, consolidating, converting, and coalescing under the single invisible banner of S Ventures. Anya and Marcus worked with ruthless efficiency. It was a masterclass in corporate rating, executed with the silent precision of a special forces operation. On the surface, nothing had changed. The market was stable. The financial news reported nothing unusual. But in the deep, dark currents of the financial world, a tsunami was gathering force, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the Prescott Empire. I used the time to erase the last traces of the invisible man. I was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I was an architect preparing to unveil his masterpiece. One morning, I walked into a high-end boutique downtown, a place I would have never dared to enter before. The clothes I had were remnants of a past life, symbols of a man who tried to be small. I bought a suit. It wasn't flashy. It was a deep charcoal gray, tailored so perfectly it felt less like clothing and more like armor. When I looked at my reflection in the three-way mirror, I saw a stranger. The tired, grief-stricken man with the slumped shoulders was gone. In his place was someone sharp, focused, his eyes holding a cold, steady light. One afternoon, Ben forwarded me an internal communication he had intercepted from a source inside Prescott Holdings. It was an email from Arthur to his head of finance. I read it, and for the first time in weeks, a grim, humorless smile touched my lips. His finance chief had flagged the unusual stock activity, warning of a potential hostile accumulation by an unknown entity. Arthur's reply was a masterwork of hubris. "It's just some vulture fund from New York trying to rattle the cage," he wrote. "They think we're old money, slow and stupid. Let them waste their cash. We'll bleed them dry and buy back the shares for pennies on the dollar after their little gambit fails. Teach them a lesson about messing with real power. Ignore it. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't see the executioner sharpening the axe right in front of him. He thought I was a bug to be swatted away, a piece of worthless dead weight. He had no idea that the quiet, unassuming man he had cast out was the very storm that was about to break over his head. His contempt was the perfect camouflage. He would never, in a million years, see me coming. On the eve of the meeting, my preparations were complete. My controlling stake of 51% was secure, hidden behind the final legal firewall until the moment of the reveal. The dossier detailing Arthur's years of fraud and embezzlement, compiled by a forensic accounting team, was encrypted on a flash drive in my pocket. My single admission ticket to the board meeting as a new stakeholder representative lay on the table. I stood before the vast window of my apartment, looking out at the glittering lights of the Seattle skyline. The city was oblivious, humming with life, unaware of the corporate drama about to unfold in one of its gleaming towers. My suit hung ready, a dark silhouette waiting to be filled. On the nightstand next to my bed sat a single small red Lego brick, the piece that was meant to be the light on top of Sam's Space Needle. I picked it up, its sharp corners pressing into my palm. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about a reckoning. It was for the boy who believed his father could build anything. It was for the quiet man who was told he was worthless. Arthur Prescott had built his world on the arrogant belief that he was untouchable. He had no idea that his world was a house of cards, and I was the storm that had finally arrived. And tomorrow I would make landfall. The boardroom of Prescott Holdings was on the top floor, a corporate throne room designed to project an aura of old-world, unshakable power. The walls were paneled with dark, polished mahogany, adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced Prescott ancestors. A single, colossal table, so glossy it looked like a black mirror, dominated the space. Seated around it were the board members, a collection of silver-haired, complacent men who had grown rich and lazy under Arthur's reign. At the head of the table, my father-in-law stood, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. Eleanor sat slightly behind him, an honorary board member and the queen to his king, radiating smug satisfaction. Arthur was in the middle of his self-congratulatory keynote speech. And so, as we look to the next fiscal year, we do so from a position of unparalleled strength. He boomed, his voice echoing in the silent, reverent room. For 75 years, the Prescott name has been synonymous with integrity, power, and growth. A legacy I have not only upheld, but expanded. We are not merely a company, we are a dynasty. It was at that precise moment that the grand double doors at the far end of the boardroom opened with a soft, almost imperceptible click. I walked in. The room's atmosphere changed instantly. The collective inhale was audible. Arthur's speech faltered, his words dying in his throat. Every single head turned towards me. I walked steadily across the plush, deep blue carpet, my footsteps silent, my eyes fixed on the man at the head of the table. I saw the progression of emotions on Arthur's face. First, utter shock, then confusion, and finally, a surge of crimson, apoplectic rage. Eleanor's perfectly painted smile froze, and then shattered. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur roared, slamming his hand down on the table, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the pristine quiet. "Security! Get this man out of my boardroom!" "This is a private meeting." Two burly security guards who had been standing by the door started to move towards me, their expressions grim. But before they could take 2 steps, a calm voice cut through the tension. It was the company's lead counsel, a man named Peterson. "Mr. Prescott, please," Peterson said, standing up, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "This gentleman is on the agenda." Arthur stared at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about, Peterson? On what agenda?" "He is the designated representative for the S Ventures Holding Group, sir," Peterson said, his voice clipped and professional. The name S Ventures sent a ripple of murmurs around the table. I saw Arthur's mind working, connecting the name to the vulture fund he had so arrogantly dismissed. But his arrogance still outweighed his fear. "S Ventures?" he sneered, looking at me with pure venom. "You sent him? Did you think intimidating my family would get you a better deal? You have no idea who you're dealing with." I ignored him, walking calmly to the empty seat at the table that had been reserved for the S Ventures representative. From there I walked to the main podium, where Arthur had just been standing. He was still sputtering, but the board was now watching me with a mixture of confusion and intense curiosity. I looked out at them, my gaze sweeping past the hostile faces, until it landed, finally, on Arthur. "Good morning," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the tense silence it carried to every corner of the room. "My name is Leo Sullivan." I let the name hang in the air for a moment. "I am the founder and sole principal of S Ventures." It was like a switch had been thrown, plunging the room into chaos. Gasps erupted. Board members started whispering frantically to one another. I saw Eleanor clutch Arthur's arm, her knuckles white, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Arthur himself looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The man he had called worthless dead weight was the mysterious corporate raider he had laughed at. The bug he'd tried to squash owned the boot. I held up a hand, and the room slowly fell silent again. For several weeks I continued, my voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. S Ventures has been consolidating its assets. I'm sure you've all been wondering about the unusual market activity. I'm here to clarify things for you. I paused, letting the anticipation build to an unbearable level. As of 8 a.m. this morning, S Ventures has executed its final acquisitions. We now control 51% of this company's voting stock. Pandemonium. One of the older board members half rose from his chair, his face pale. 51%? That's impossible. I assure you, it is very possible, I said, my eyes never leaving Arthur's, which means, as of this moment, I am the majority shareholder of Prescott Holdings. You can't! Arthur finally roared, finding his voice. It was thin and reedy, all the power gone from it. This is illegal! A scam! I'll have you in court for the rest of your life. I don't think so, Arthur, I said softly. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the small, encrypted flash drive, and calmly plugged it into the podium's console. The screen behind me, which still displayed a chart of Prescott Holdings' record profits, flickered and changed. Suddenly, it was filled with documents. Scanned bank statements from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, forged invoices, internal emails authorizing illegal fund transfers, a web of deceit, all leading back to one man. And my first act as majority shareholder, I announced to the stunned, silent room, is to address a matter of internal theft. Specifically, the matter of the $27 million that our chairman, Mr. Arthur Prescott, has embezzled from this company and its shareholders over the last 6 years to pay for his personal luxuries and cover his gambling debts. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Then it broke. It wasn't me who broke it. It was the other board members. The complacent, silver-haired men who had been Arthur's cronies just minutes before were now looking at the screen, then at Arthur, their faces contorting with rage. They were looking at a thief who had been stealing from their pockets. "Is this true, Arthur?" one of them bellowed, slamming his own fist on the table. Arthur stammered, his face a ghastly shade of white. It's a misunderstanding. Fabricated." But no one was listening. The illusion of his power had been shattered. His dynasty had crumbled in the space of 5 minutes. He was no longer a titan. He was just a common criminal, exposed in his own throne room. I stood at the podium, watching the chaos unfold. I looked at Arthur, a scared, pathetic old man, being surrounded by the wolves he used to lead. I looked at Eleanor, who was staring at me, her eyes wide with a terror that was immensely satisfying. The reckoning was here. It was swift. It was total. And I was the architect of it all. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. By the time I had returned to my apartment, the story was already the lead item on every news channel. The headlines were a symphony of destruction. Prescott Empire topples in shocking hostile takeover, read the Seattle Business Journal. Cedal Real Estate. Tit and Arthur Prescott accused of massive fraud by mysterious new owner, blared the national newswires. My face, a stoic photo taken from my old company ID, was suddenly everywhere. They called me an enigma, a ghost, a corporate raider of unprecedented skill. Reporters scrambled to piece together my story, but all they found was the thin, uninteresting file of Leo Sullivan, the mid-level IT architect. The narrative they spun was one of a brilliant, underestimated genius, who had played the long game, a David who had not just slain Goliath, but had seized his kingdom and salted the earth. They didn't know about the little boy in the hospital, or the red Lego brick in my pocket. They saw a corporate coup. They didn't see the quiet, desperate act of a father's love. The fallout for the Prescotts was a public crucifixion. Arthur was immediately suspended from the board pending a full federal investigation. Their stock, once a bastion of stability, had been frozen and was now worthless. Their phones rang off the hook, not with offers of support, but with calls from creditors, betrayed partners, and the media, all hungry for a piece of the carcass. The untouchable dynasty had become a toxic asset overnight. I heard through Ben that Julian Vance, the artist, had abandoned Chloe almost immediately. He was an opportunist who had attached himself to the Prescott name, to the aura of power and money. When that name became synonymous with fraud and ruin, he vanished, leaving Chloe to face the wreckage alone. It was a predictable, pathetic, and perfectly just outcome. Her ticket to a better life had been voided the moment her father's empire fell. 3 days after the board meeting, there was a frantic, insistent buzzing from the intercom in my apartment lobby. It was Chloe. I knew this moment was coming. I told security to let her up. The woman who stepped out of the elevator was a ghost of her former self. The polished, confident art dealer was gone, replaced by someone fragile and frayed at the edges. She wore an expensive but rumpled dress. Her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were wild with a desperate, panicked energy. She rushed towards me as I stood in my doorway. "Leo," she cried, her voice cracking. "Thank God. I've been trying to reach you. I had no idea. I swear I had no idea what my father was doing." I just stood there, my face a blank canvas, and let her talk. "He lied to all of us, to everyone," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. "And Julian, he left me. He just left. I was wrong, Leo. I was so wrong. I was lost after we lost Sam. I wasn't thinking straight. I made a terrible, terrible mistake." She reached out, trying to take my hand, but I didn't move. "Please," she begged, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I saw the news. They say you're in control of everything now. You're so powerful. I always knew you had it in you, Leo. I always believed you were special deep down." I almost laughed at the absurdity, the sheer, naked opportunism of her words. She didn't mourn the man I was. She was just desperate to attach herself to the man I had become. "We can fix this," she continued, a manic gleam in her eyes. "You and me. We can have it all now. The life we were always meant to have. A real life, built on your success. We can start over." I listened to her entire, desperate plea without interruption. I let her spin her web of lies and half-truths and convenient remorse. When she was finally finished, breathless and staring at me with pleading eyes, I spoke. My voice was quiet, devoid of hatred or anger. It was something far worse. It was indifferent. "You're right," I said softly. "You did make a mistake. Your mistake was thinking that man, the one you're talking about, still exists." She looked at me confused. What do you mean?" I took a small step back, creating an unbridgeable distance between us. "The Leo you knew, the man who loved you, the quiet man who would have forgiven you for anything. He died in that hospital, sitting in a chair next to our son's bed. He was buried at that funeral when you chose to stand with your father instead of with him. You are talking to a stranger." The last flicker of hope in her eyes died. The color drained from her face. She finally understood. There was nothing left here for her to salvage. The man she had discarded as worthless was gone forever, and the man who stood in his place looked at her and saw nothing. "You chose their world, Chloe," I said, my voice as final as a closing door. "You chose the money, the status, the name. Now you can have it. You can have the ashes of it. That's all that's left." I turned, pressed the intercom, and spoke to the lobby security. "Please escort Miss Prescott from the building. She is not to be admitted again." Chloe stared at me, her mouth agape in disbelief. The man who had been thrown off her family's property was now having her removed. She tried to say my name one last time, but no sound came out. She was escorted away, a ghost being exorcised from my new life. I closed the door without watching her leave and walked back to the window, not looking down at the street, but out at the horizon. The storm had passed. In the weeks and months that followed, I didn't seek out news of the Prescotts, but it was impossible to avoid. Their downfall was a slow, public spectacle, a case study in karmic velocity. I watched it all from the quiet detachment of my new life, not with glee or malice, but with the grim satisfaction of watching a long overdue debt being paid in full. The first domino was Arthur. 2 weeks after the board meeting, federal agents arrested him at his mansion. It was the lead story on the evening news. I saw the footage. The once invincible titan of industry, looking frail and shrunken in a rumpled suit, being led in handcuffs to a black sedan. He tried to hide his face from the cameras, but there was no hiding from this. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, embezzlement, securities fraud. His entire career had been built on a foundation of lies, and the house of cards had finally come down. The trial was swift. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided, he was found guilty on all counts. The Prescott legacy, his obsession, was now a permanent stain of disgrace. Next came the financial collapse. With Arthur's assets frozen and the company I now controlled refusing to cover his personal liabilities, the banks moved in. It was a methodical dismantling of an empire. The waterfront mansion, the fortress of their arrogance, went up for auction, a for sale by bank sign staked into its once perfect lawn. I saw photos online of movers hauling away their expensive furniture and art. The fleet of luxury cars was repossessed. Their entire world, built on stolen money, was being liquidated to pay back what was stolen. They weren't just ruined, they were being erased. Eleanor's punishment was not a legal one, but in many ways it was more fitting. Her currency had always been social status, and she was now bankrupt. Her name was quietly removed from the charity boards she had once ruled with an iron fist. Her invitations to the galas and exclusive events that were her lifeblood simply stopped coming. The socialite friends who had once flattered her now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering behind their hands. Ben told me he'd heard a story about her at a high-end grocery store, her credit card being declined for a bottle of wine. She, who had judged me for my simple life, was now an outcast, a pariah, in the very world she had worshipped. Her hell wasn't a prison cell, it was a life of quiet, crushing irrelevance. As for Chloe, her fate was the quietest of all. Stripped of her family name, her wealth, and her social connections, she was left with nothing. The gallery fired her. Her fair-weather friends vanished. The last I heard, she had sold her downtown apartment and was working as a receptionist at a dental office in a distant suburb. She had spent her entire life running from what she perceived as a mediocre, ordinary existence, only to find herself completely alone in the middle of it. She hadn't been destroyed in a blaze of glory like her father. She had simply faded, becoming one of the invisible people she had always looked down upon. I took no active part in any of this. I simply let the consequences of their actions run their natural course. My work was done the day I stood at that podium. Their ruin was of their own making. I had just been the one to finally turn on the lights. One evening, I saw a final news report about the Prescott case. It was a wrap-up, a final chapter on the fallen dynasty. After it was over, I picked up the remote and calmly turned off the television. I felt no lingering anger, no residue of hate. I only felt a profound sense of quiet. The scales had been balanced. The noise was over. The debt was paid. For the first time, I felt truly free to turn away from the ashes and face the future. A year passed. The noise of the Prescott scandal faded, becoming just another chapter in the city's history. My life found a new, quiet rhythm, one defined not by vengeance but by purpose. I didn't move into the Prescott mansion or take my seat at the head of their broken table. I had S Ventures dissolve the company, selling off its assets and placing the profits into a trust. I bought a modest house on a quiet bluff overlooking the Puget Sound, a simple place with large windows that let in the soft, gray light of the Pacific Northwest. It was a home filled with the scent of salt water and cedar, a place that reminded me of the simple, honest world my parents had given me. My wealth was no longer a secret weapon, but I didn't let it become a trophy. Remembering my father's words that money was a tool, I finally put it to its proper use. I established the Sam Sullivan Foundation for Young Innovators. It was my tribute, my promise, my way of ensuring my son's light would never truly go out. The foundation's mission was simple: to fund STEM programs in underprivileged schools, to provide scholarships for bright kids who just needed a chance, and to build workshops, innovators' garages where any child could have access to tools, computers, and Lego bricks to build whatever worlds they could imagine. My work became finding and funding the next generation of builders, dreamers, and quiet geniuses. In helping them build their futures, I began to slowly rebuild my own. One crisp autumn afternoon, I drove out to a secluded beach I used to visit with Sam. The air was cool and clean, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves and the cry of a distant seagull. I carried a small, carefully protected box with me. I sat on a large piece of driftwood, the same one we had once pretended was a pirate ship, and I opened the box. Inside was the Lego Space Needle. It was finished. After the storm had passed, I had taken all the pieces back to my new home. In the quiet evenings, piece by piece, I had completed our project. I had followed his crumpled instructions, my large, clumsy fingers assembling the delicate framework he had so carefully started. The final piece I placed was the small red 2x4 block, the flashing beacon on the very top. I held it now, the culmination of a shared dream. The pain of Sam's absence was a dull, constant ache in my heart, a scar that would never truly fade. But as I looked at the completed tower, the grief was no longer sharp and all-consuming. It was mingled with a quiet sense of peace. The tower wasn't a monument to what I had lost. It was a testament to what we had shared. I didn't do it for revenge. I see that now. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything and leaves you with nothing but ash. I did it for justice. I did it for the little boy who deserved a world that wasn't governed by the cruel, empty values of people like the Prescotts. A gentle breeze blew in off the water. I looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of gray sea and sky. My son was gone, but his love, his spark of creation, lived on in the foundation that bore his name, and in the quiet resolve in my own heart. The hate was gone, the anger was gone, and all that was left was a father's love. The tower was finished. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could start building again,